Welcome to the Dairy Farmers Digest, a podcast dedicated to all things dairy farming. Each episode, we will talk to industry leaders who share their insights and experiences into the dairy business. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the DFD podcast. I'm your host, Keith Schweitzer. It is a beautiful spring day here in Ontario. We have Tom Kilcer on today from Advanced Ag Systems, and I guess in the industry you're more known for the photosynthetic drying, or more commonly kind of termed as hay in a day. I understand you're in Tennessee now. You were in New York last time I talked to you. That would have been about 3 years ago now.
Yes, we moved several years ago. I won't go into the reasons why. We'll leave politics out. But it's been interesting down here, and we're having another breakthrough. We're working on another breakthrough crop, which is male sterile sorghum, and it's looking really, really good.
Okay. So is that because is sorghum a hybrid then?
It's forage sorghum,
Okay.
and we just don't have any seeds on it. It's like sterile corn, which
Yeah,
nobody
okay.
wants, but
Yeah, but if it makes feed, right?
it turns out we made some changes in the harvest, and it'll rival corn silage with a whole bunch of nutritional advantages.
So are you taking that as a whole crop with
Yes,
the grain? No, it won't produce grain though.
there's no grain,
Yeah, so it's just grass.
but it's not just grass, because we let it go for 8 weeks, and it has the energy builds up in the cells instead of the seeds. In corn, it goes 8 weeks, it builds up in the grain, and seeds of sorghum are about the size of number 3 shot and about as digestible as number 3 shot.
So that's really interesting. And what's I'm not really familiar. Like I've been to Nashville, which I think anybody that's Tennessee that's where they end up heading. But what's the dairy industry like there?
Nashville is right about it. The state. There's 3 parts: east, central, and west. The dairy industry, I think, was very big back in the 20s and 30s, and I think we're down to 60 some herds now. It has really, really fallen off. Some of the farmers are moving ahead, trying to stay competitive, and then there's a certain attitude or culture here that nothing has changed for a long time. Even my wife, who doesn't milk cows, understands it. And she was appalled, but we're changing that.
And is there much of a beef industry there, whether it be feedlot or cow-calf?
Huge beef industry. But again, it's run in 1950s technology, and they wonder why, when they bring their cows to the auction, Tennessee animals get less than other animals.
That's really interesting too.
Yeah, we got our work cut out for us.
That's good. It's good to start at the top or at the bottom and work your way up. So you see the most drastic changes there. Anyways, with the weather outside, I know I brought you on to talk about, some considerations for this year's winter forages and hay crop coming up, and just walking some triticale fields. I haven't actually hit any rye fields that I know of yet, and hay fields. Like the stuff it looks phenomenal right now. Like here in kind of Ontario, I would say alfalfa would have broke dormancy around that probably middle of March, so probably 18th, 20th, maybe even some of it earlier, maybe the more south you get. And then the triticales, they kind of livened up right around that time or a little bit before there. So there's some really good tillering, and the alfalfa stands we had a pretty mild winter and without a ton of moisture. So the alfalfa stands came through really, really well. And the crop just looks phenomenal right now. We've had a few frosts on it, but that's not really concerning to me at this point. But yeah, it's just I have this idea, and maybe you can help me out with this, but I've always thought the years that we really take a hit on yield on first cut in some of these winter forages is typically I noticed that we don't break dormancy until later on in the year, like mid to late April. And I find that when we do get big yields, like last year, we had phenomenal hay yields and really, really phenomenal triticale rye yields. And it just seemed like the stuff broke dormancy really early. So I was just wondering if there's any truth to that, or is that just my own crazy idea?
Well, there's two parts to it, and it's something we found in our original research. Yes, the longer the growing season, the more you're going to get. My worst crop is when on May 1st, we usually break dormancy beginning of April, and on May 1st, it went to 93 or 94 degrees Fahrenheit, and all the plants bolted. And that just screwed things up royally. But the other factor, and this is a huge piece that people forget, the number one driving force for yield in the winter forages is when did you plant it? That was something I had to get through my head, is that we went 2 weeks ahead of the wheat planting date. And this was in New York where I did most of my work. 2 weeks ahead of the wheat planting date. And we went from 2.25 tons of dry matter to 3.5 to 4 tons of dry matter. And in Ohio, they're getting 5. And this year on the plots here in Tennessee, we were getting 6 tons of dry matter, which is a phenomenal crop. I'm used to the stuff maybe being up 32, 34 inches tall. This was 48 to 52 inches tall.
Wow.
Yeah,
And just what do you
tremendous.
say, 2 weeks earlier?
2 weeks, we have to plant it at least 2 weeks ahead of the wheat planting date. Now, down here, we're still trying to figure out that, because here it'll grow all winter. We get 50-degree weather. Of course, we had in January, we had 9 below 0 Fahrenheit, which was horrible. But normally we get a lot of 50-degree days, and it grows all winter, and that allows for more tillers and more spring growth. Up where you are, when you get a warm winter, it's going to it'll grow on the warmer days. But the key year in and year out has been, when did you plant it? Did you plant it on time? And then the second thing we found, did you put about 50, 60 pounds of nitrogen in with it? Both of those factors are completely opposite of what we do for high yield wheat. And a friend of mine kept telling me, use the high yield wheat step. So I did. It didn't work. We went the exact opposite of high yield wheat, and we got high yield winter forage. 4 tons, easily done.
So that's the caveat to this year's winter forages. Like we had a pretty late corn silage for us. Like typically we're mid-September, around the 20th or so, when we're doing a lot of corn silage here in Western Ontario. There wasn't a whole lot done by then. A lot of it was done, in the first couple of weeks, even up to Thanksgiving here in Canada, which is the second Saturday. Like most of the silage was kind of the week before that. So it was like the first full week of October, and a lot of the winter forages didn't go in after that. Like in an ideal world, I would say our wheat date here for most of Western Ontario would have been, it's usually about the 15th of October. So we're looking, you want to get it in by the end of September. And we just didn't have corn silage off, and soybeans weren't mature enough to get them off. So we could get a crop planted in behind it. So,
But you had a warm, open winter, and it made up
yeah,
for the whole thing. I can't give hard and fast rules, because these pieces come in and change the rules of the game right in midstream, because you had a very good winter.
I don't think we had our first frost till almost the end of October in a lot of places.
Mm-hmm.
And November was pretty wide open too. Like
Yep.
it was a nice no. All I remember is I was deer hunting and I was in a t-shirt at point. So that's the
Yeah.
first week of November.
Yeah. That's unusual. You're used to being all
Yeah,
bundled up.
yeah, exactly. Well, it's usually around zero, or you might get 10 degrees during the day, but
Yeah.
the odd year we'll get up into that. I have to think about Fahrenheit here for a second for you, into the mid 60s.
Yep. Yeah. I
And
have my
tip.
Canadian, I have my Canadian chart that'll give me the numbers.
Yeah,
This is the handiest
yeah,
thing I got when I was up in Canada. It
yeah,
converts all my numbers for me.
yeah. But it looks like it's tillered really well. Like I was walking some stuff yesterday, and I was pretty happy with the tillering on it.
Good,
And
good.
it's funny, we have we have like a common seed variety, and then we have a product called XTR, and like you could see the visible line in the field where it was.
Yes.
And
Better genetics is always
yeah,
better.
yeah, and like it looks really good. So it might be a little bit late now, but like I would think most of the nitrogen's out on it. But what are your thoughts on sulfur on some of these things too? Because I know it's been important on our legume, like our alfalfa crops, and I was wondering if there's an effect with the winter cereals.
I did some work with this and I put 115 pounds of nitrogen on as just urea. And then I also put on 100 pounds of nitrogen as ammonium sulfate. The 115 pounds of urea gave me 12% crude protein. The 100 pounds of ammonium sulfate gave me 17% crude protein. Sulfur is critical.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with like we don't get the sulfur out of the atmosphere anymore like we
Not
used to,
anymore.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
Just with the
We
emissions
got quite a
changes.
bit from your fires last summer.
Well, I we got a lot of it too, and I want to get into
Yeah.
that a little bit too because like just looking back on looking at samples here all winter from last year's feed, I've noticed kind of a marked increase in ash.
Mhm.
And, typically we'll run sub 10 for the most part, like 8 to 10 in that kind of range, which I think is pretty good. I've seen samples up as high as, 16, 17 this year, a lot of them in that like 11, 12, 14 range. And I'm just wondering if it was growing conditions last year. Is it how we handled like cut the crop and got it into the bunker? I just don't know because it's right across the board. It's not there hasn't been very many samples that I would say are low. It's more kind of moderates and highs this year.
Well, ironically, in your case this year, it may literally be ash to a degree, small particles of ash landing on the plants. But most of what I see as an ash issue has to do with the mower and the cutting height. This idea that we can cut right down to the dirt with a disc mower and conditioners to make sure it's all in train makes a huge difference. If you go 2 points, we went from 9 to 11% ash in the exact same ration. And the change in ash was 1.9 pounds of milk per cow per day, which if you do the math with a bunch of cows and a 305-day lactation and the price on your milk, you get scared at how big that number gets.
Oh,
And when we
absolutely.
got up to 16, 17% ash, we were losing 10 pounds of milk. And it was mostly because of the machines. They sell the mowers to the farmers and they want it to cut real close. So the farmer says, wow, this does a good job. And then he tells all his neighbors to buy the same machine because it does a good job. And then when they get the feed in the bunk, it's got ash up the wazoo. And they ask you, why aren't you getting more milk out of their cows when in fact you're trying to milk dirt and dirt doesn't milk. You need to set those cutter bars up 3 to 3.5 on alfalfa and alfalfa grass where you want to keep the grass or straight grass, you better be at 4. When you're done mowing a grass field, if it's not green, you screwed up both that and the next 3 crops. Plus you mixed a whole bunch of dirt in with your feed.
Yeah, and I'm just kind of doing some math here on that. So like at 8.5% ash, that's 85 kilograms per metric ton of dry matter
Mm-hmm.
of ash going in there. So if you look at it, at a 16, you're looking at double the amount of ash going in there. So milk on rocks, from what
No,
I understand. No,
nope. People keep trying, but it doesn't work.
I know. And like it is just simple math. And it's like, I kind of wonder too, like you often see like just the amount of feed that you go through in the winter. And I wonder if that, like with the higher ash, you just put more dirt. Like there's just less
Mm-hmm.
feed in your bunk. Like you could have good density and all these other things that are going positive for you. But at the end of the day, like you put more dirt into your silage pile. And maybe that's
Yeah.
maybe that's why I'm seeing, a little bit more butyric acid and things like that this year, higher pHs than what I would typically.
The weather can set you up for some of that, but mostly it's in the mower. And what we did find on the positive side, A, when we eliminated conditioners, because we're making haylage. We don't need it with wide swath same day haylage. Uh, they don't they don't create a vortex and a vacuum to make sure all the dirt is thoroughly mixed in. It just cuts it and drops it on the ground. My gold standards is a sidebar sickle. It cuts it and drops it on the ground, and no dirt gets in it. But the other piece is, because we're laying it out wide, we need to get it back into a windrow. And research in Minnesota, Michigan, Connecticut, and I think it was New York, found that if you run a merger, the way a merger lifts the crop straight up, any dirt that's in there tends to fall out. And so when you make a windrow out of it, or a chopping swath, it actually reduced the amount of ash that was in the windrows. And they were actually able to measure that. So if you're using a merger, that helps to correct some of it. We don't want it in there in the first place, but the merger will help leaving that dirt in the field. As long as you're not running the merger right down to the ground and at a real high speed so that it has to dig into the dirt and fling it up to get the stuff up. As long as the merger is run correctly and it picks up from the front of the machine, it does an excellent job reducing or eliminating the ash that you did get in.
And like with the ash too, like it's my understanding that we're bringing in other soil-borne issues, whether it be like Clostridium and things like that, that can kind of affect your fermentation as well.
Yes, yes, very much so. Yep.
Yeah, because it's like we've all seen those hay samples where, you know, you go to the bunk and grab them and then your truck stinks and your hands stink and your wife's mad at you. Like you get that lime green color, which is usually a pretty good indicator that you've got high ash in there without even looking at a lab sample. So I guess it goes back to the people trying to make sterile silage where, you know, if we look at cows, like mold can really affect rumen fermentation. If you go to a wine or a beer maker, like they're not gonna, like they don't want mold in there because it affects their
Yep.
fermentation process, right? So
Yes.
like we're just trying to
Yes.
make it as clean can be, and that's pretty hard on a farm level because we're working outside with other contaminants, right?
It's not, if they put some thought to it, it isn't that hard. And that's where I guess I disagree. It isn't that hard if you think about it. If you set the mower up so that you're not mowing into the dirt, you use a merger to bring it together, and don't run the merger right down, rooting around in the dirt to get every last little speck of feed. You use an inoculant. I did some work with triticale and we mowed it. And immediately after mowing, 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, 24 and 36 hours, we put inoculant on each one of those samples. And it was replicated like 6 times. We had no Clostridia and no Butyric, even though it was wet, because we didn't have dirt mixed in and it had high sugars from its natural growth cycle when we harvested it.
Yeah, and I guess that's the other caveat too, is like we got to keep it clean, but we also want to make sure that we kind of maximize the amount of sugars
Yeah. Yeah.
that are in that, because it's just a calculation. If I'm not mistaken, like the wetter you are, the lower your sugar is going to.
Not necessarily.
Well, maybe I'm not
Well,
explaining it well, but
yeah. Because one of the things that we found, and I found this with the male sterile sorghum, and I definitely found it with the triticale. One year we couldn't use the samples because they were 26% sugar on a dry matter basis. These winter forages really crank out high sugar levels if given a chance. You have a sunny day and a cool night, you're in great shape. You have a sunny day and a real warm night, you're not as in great a shape because nighttime respiration burns off what you were producing during the day. But we're harvesting this crop in the springtime when it's sunny days and cool nights, and the sugar levels can be very high, which if you have the high sugar and you put an inoculant with it, it'll ferment rapidly and drop the pH and keep those sugars in there. The other piece that we have done is that with flag leaf harvest, where you're getting it at the right stage, we're moving our cut up to 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. A, it reduces leachate. B, it protects more of those sugars inside of whole plant cells. And so then you're conserving that energy to the mouth of the cow.
So are you saying that on a chop length, like the physical length of it's, 20,
Yes.
25 mils?
I got to do a conversion here and tell you what see if I can find
Be
what is
like
an inch.
three quarters of an inch to an inch versus 20 mils to 25 mils
Okay. Yeah.
millimeters.
Yeah. An inch is, yeah, 2.5 centimeters. Yeah. Anyway, that's what we have gone up to. And they worry about the hollow stems not packing. Well, if they're so hard, you already chopped it too late. That's why they're hard. But if you cut that stuff on the time when it's flag leaf stage, it's going to squish down very well. Now, John Winchell of Altec, he had done some additional work on mine, and he found that if you measure where the head is down inside, as the last leaf is coming out, look where the head is. If it's 4 inches down, you probably have 3 or 4 days till your harvest. If it's an inch and a half to 2 inches, you need to get the mower out there now and start mowing because it grows very rapidly. In our plots here in Tennessee, we measured over 4 inches of growth overnight. We were getting ready to harvest. We did all our measurements one day and then came back the next day. It was a warm day, 75 degrees. It grew 4 inches overnight.
I know I got into a lot more of that last year, just making sure like where's that flag leaf coming up the
Yes.
stem and how close are we for it emerging. And
Mm-hmm. And then
it's
look
really,
at the weather report. That's the other piece.
yeah.
If you're at stage 8, where that flag leaf is just starting to poke out, and you got 2 nice days and then a week of rain, cut it. All right, you're losing about 30% of yield, but you're going to gain 30% of crap because it's actually more than that because you're too late to harvest. And we can't take fiber out for dairy cows. So I'd rather have a little less yield and higher digestibility of that fiber so we can support a high forage diet than to wait and gain a little extra yield and then have the stuff be garbage.
Well, I know, and I find a shift here in Ontario is maybe not as much last year, but like definitely the year before, there was a lot more of the winter forages being grown. And I think part of that too is I think producers are seeing the benefit of having a grass crop in their rations just because the fiber digestibility, the sugar, all that really great stuff that it brings. And the other thing too was just inventories. Like 2022, we came out of a pretty dry summer and we didn't have a lot of inventory. So a lot of people had planted some of these spring forages or winter forages so they could have some build inventory early in 23. Last year, we had so much hay and really, really phenomenal corn silage. So you didn't see as much of it go in the ground, but I think the producers that are moving that way are still planning on planting it, and they did this year. And yeah, I'm glad they did. It is really nice feed to work with.
Mm-hmm. Well, that phone call was actually my neighbor up in New York, and he started in it when he was running short on haylage. And now he says, I can't do this without growing winter forage because he says he never knows where his haylage is going to run out. But he says, if I have this feed, I put it in and they keep right on milking. The other piece that we found, and this was up in upper New York where we first, one of the farmers first found out about it, and now we're using it all the way down here in the South, is when it gets warm and the cows go into the summer slump, they save the triticale forage harvested at flag leaf stage. And as that temperature goes up, they put the triticale in. And Dr. Grant at Miner Institute said because of the high NDF digestibility, it eliminates the summer slump, which is a
Yeah,
huge factor down here.
well, more so for you, I think maybe than well, it gets bloody hot here too. But I think that with these highly digestible forages, like he's absolutely right. I've been seeing the same thing in the field here is that, a lot of times we'll add it in maybe a month after we take it off. So, we're starting in late June, early July, and the cows just truck through. Like the fat test, like we're not finding fat tests drop off. Like we will typically get that 0.2 less compared to winter, but even some herds last year, they just, they lost 0.1 and just trucked right on and making like lots of pounds of components. So it's making sense. Now, is it a good idea to go to straight winter forages, or like in your opinion, is it better to leave some alfalfa, like not only in the rotation, but just for
That
rotation, but and just
well,
risk mitigation too?
I do have some farmers that have shortened up their season of corn. And the reason they shortened it up is so they could do a better job with their winter triticale. Remember what I talked about this planting date? Now you're looking at a 30% difference in yield getting it in on time. So they grow a shorter season corn and they grow winter forage. And they said they had a 35% yield increase per acre off of that whole field than just growing full season corn. And not only did they get a higher yield increase, but now their soil is staying on their fields. The nutrients in the soil is staying in the soil in the plant, not leaching out of the field. The nutrients are not washing off the field. There's a huge amount of environmental benefits from it. But at the same time, they're producing one of the best, highly digestible forages we can put in front of cows. And so we have a number of farms that are going to corn silage, shorter season corn silage, and winter triticale. I don't like it because that tells me at some point something's going to come out of left field and going to really clean our clock. I still like planting some alfalfa. The interesting part is when we take our triticale off, what the farmers are doing is you take your triticale off, and usually it's just before the rest of your haylage is ready. So you mow off your triticale, chop it, you get all the rest of your haylage. And when you're done, we come back and we spray a high gallonage of water, a low rate of glyphosate, like 2/3 of a quart, give it an hour to dry, come into that stubble and plant our alfalfa the beginning of June. I know you're not supposed to plant alfalfa then, you're supposed to plant it real early. Well, you plant it the beginning of June, a whole bunch of things comes into your favor. First, you just rebalanced your workload. Secondly, when you plant it then, the ground is warm. The alfalfa jumps out of the ground, and Phytophthora and Pythium and other diseases have a less chance of taking it out. Third, the stubble of the triticale keeps it about 2 or 3 inches off the ground for the drying winds. So the ground is moist right up to the surface. And if it rains, it catches that water and runs in. And then finally, as a farmer friend of mine found out, he had a field that he plowed it all up, he put in tile, they smoothed it, they picked the stones, they put lime on and fertilized and everything, and planted in early April. And then across the road from that, they had another 30-acre fields of triticale. They mowed the triticale off and used the process I just ran through. Well, in mid to late June, they got 4 inches of partly cloudy in about 15 minutes. And he said his conventional April tilled field was a mess. The seeding literally had washed out. He had gullies all through it. There were stones washed out of the field. He said, I had to plow it all up and start over. And across the road was 30 acres of the nicest alfalfa you ever saw in triticale stubble. It did not wash at all, and it was growing better than the conventional crop. That's a dirty little secret most people haven't really taken advantage of. We can grow alfalfa or clover or anything else in it. Legumes like to grow in the triticale stubble because the allelopathy keeps the grasses and weeds out and it doesn't affect the legumes. Soybeans do well, alfalfa does well, clover does well.
Yeah, and actually some of the best soybean crops, like this is one thing that guys here in Ontario have been really amazed with is they'll go in and get 3 to 4 ton of dry matter off the triticale, plant soybeans and get 60, 70 bushels of soybeans
Yeah,
after
with no work. It's not
with
supposed
no
to be
work.
that easy.
No, last year we got a little bit burned just because it was so dry up till about the beginning of July that, you know,
Mhm. Yeah.
the ground was tough trying to get stuff planted in there. And the guys that had corn, it was kind of interesting. Even after the rye last year, uh, there was like 3 weeks different emergence on corn
Yeah.
on the rye, just because some of it germinated really early and some of it needed that little bit of rain to get it germinated. So there is a lot of variance in the field all year. So
Yeah, I have a picture a farmer friend of mine sent of his little daughter. She was about 3. She was standing next to tasseled, well-eared corn. The tassel was as tall as she was. They had taken triticale off, came back in and planted corn, and they had no rain. But he said the interesting thing is my neighbor across the road did not grow triticale, and his corn didn't look any better than mine did. But I hauled off 3.5 to 4 tons of dry matter off of that field and had short corn. So yeah, the weather will be against you at times, but you're still ahead of the game, keeping something on the ground year around.
Yeah, and like it's interesting too because I know I have a lot of people that spring seed alfalfa and kind of follow more conventional where, if they get a nice window in late March, early April, they try and get it in the ground, either direct seeded or with a cover crop like oats. And I've got a lot of people that do it in August, well, after winter wheat. And the stuff after winter wheat, like we are getting some really phenomenal stands. You don't get any feed off of it that year per
Mm-hmm.
se.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people are direct seeding it, like they're not putting a nurse crop or anything with it. So there's a little advantage that, but you already got the weed off, so you got your crop out of it for the year, and like just thick, gorgeous stands. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what, when we first did this, I had the idea back probably in early 2000. I wonder if this will work. So I went out with my drill and I tried it. I use a conventional drill with press wheels to put
yeah,
the seed in. And a friend of mine, I did that in June, and a friend of mine looked at it in September and he says, this doesn't look like a new seeding. It looks like a 2-year-old stand. That's how vigorous it was growing. And it was a
yeah,
dry spring too.
yeah, yeah. I'm never too concerned with a dry spring. I'm more concerned with a dry late July and August
Yeah, when you really need to fill, yeah.
when you really need it. Yeah, yeah. Uh, and on that too, like I know we talked about some cut height and a little bit of cut timing, but like what about cut timing on alfalfa too? Because we'll be into that window here before you know it too.
80 centimeters. That's the height we cut our alfalfa. Dr. Cherney did an incredible amount of really good work. And if you go to his site, forages.org, there's a spreadsheet in there. You put in the height of your alfalfa, you put in the percent alfalfa, and what the weather is going to be, whether it's warmer than normal, cooler than normal, or normal. And it'll tell you how many days until it's ready to harvest. And once we started using height to harvest, our digestibility of our NDF went right up because we use the quality and growth of the plant. We don't go by planting harvest date anymore. We use where is the plants actually at. And in some cases, we have harvested as early as the 3rd of May. Other times, we've harvested it the 25th of May, depending on the spring. So forages.org is what you look up, and look up the determining the alfalfa cutting, and there's also a grass cutting piece in there. But if you look it up, you just plug the data in, measure your fields, and you're set. Interesting piece of this, when I first came out with this to the farmers, one of our farmers, a small farm, his daughter looked at the information and she took the clipbook and she went out and measured every field on their dad's farm and how high was the alfalfa. And then she sorted it in the order they needed to be harvested. South-facing fields were ready before north-facing fields. Well-drained fields were ready before south-facing, fully drained fields, and fields with a lot of grass were ready much earlier than fields with alfalfa. Because if you have mostly grass and the alfalfa is 13 inches tall, you need to cut that grass if you want to get top milk out of it. But if you're cutting alfalfa, we're looking at 30 inches when I say 80 centimeters are tall. You use that and you figure out what fields are ready now, and you use that. And then as you go through harvesting, all right, we did field A, B, C. We're going to do field D. It's the next one ready, but we've got 3 days of rain. Skip the field. Don't do it. Don't make everything else late. Skip over that field and go to the next field that's at high quality and keep on mowing. And when you're done, come back and you get those fields that were late. That goes to the heifers. This way we don't need a bunch of crapola haylage mixed in with real good stuff. And then you as a nutritionist are struggling to get milk out of it because it theoretically tests good, but it really isn't because it's got this garbage mixed in with it. So you just walk through your fields, start with your grass fields and increasingly more, let more alfalfa. And if it rains, skip it and go to the next one that's ready when the sun comes out. It's a simple system, but boy, it has huge impact on the quality of the digestible NDF you have for your cows.
And do you follow that through the subsequent cuttings as well, or is this just a rule for
No,
first
no,
cut?
this is just for the first cutting.
Yeah, and so then do you just look at calendar date, like depending on your 3 cuts or 4 cuts?
Well, some of it will also depend on the temperature. If you get real high temperatures, your second cutting is only good for heifers because the high temperature drives the digestibility of the NDF down. I know it just pains you to no end to take nice second cutting and stick it in front of heifers, but they don't need the high digestibility. Your milk cows do. And so if it gets to be real hot, that's where it needs to go. And then when it cools off in August and you're getting third cutting, you're going to have really good digestible material again. You can't use a hard and fast box. You need to use a system. How much alfalfa, how much grass was in there, what has the temperature been? And that's where the art of farming comes in, that the farmers are better at than you and I any day, is making the art of decision on the second and third cuttings.
Yeah, and then is it worth doing fourth cutting, I guess? Like if a farmer's sitting there, should I do say 3 cuttings or 4 cuttings? Like what's the impact on next year's cross or crop? And there's also a financial impact as well, because if somebody's hiring a custom chopper to come in and do all 4 cuts, like is there that much of a yield advantage or is there a yield drag on it?
Well, what is going to happen, and it's something they came out with back when I first started in working in cooperative extension in early 1980s, 19, not 18. But when I first started then, they said, wow, we could get 4 cuttings and we can get a frost cutting and the alfalfa stand is still in. I had one of the farmers, he had mowed the outside of his field and he had left the inside of the field because something came up and he stopped and he never got back to finish, but he chopped it all off and then never got back to harvest that late cut. The next spring, I got a beautiful picture. The outside of the field was all vigorously growing alfalfa. The inside, the other way around, the inside of the field was all vigorously growing alfalfa. The outside of the field was all yellow dandelions. And the alfalfa was only 2/3 as tall as the stuff that he did not cut in the fall. I'm not a fan of fall cuttings. I'd rather leave it there, get your 3 cuttings in, and make sure you're getting enough off each cutting that it's economical to run the equipment over the field. But then if you're using the wide swath system, your sugars and digestibility are up and the stuff is still good feed. But going to get every last nth degree of cutting, you're adding cost every time you drive over the field. And that's where it's getting a little embarrassing because the farmers that aren't growing alfalfa go out and take a 4-ton or 5-ton 1 cutting of triticale. They're done with it and plant their corn. And then they come back and they chop their corn. They're not running all over the fields all summer long trying to get alfalfa. So that piece we already covered.
Yeah. Well, and there is a huge cost to it. And I was actually
Yep.
just I walked down to the local diner for lunch here and seen one of my clients and he stopped and talked and his sentiment was like, man, equipment's expensive.
He had what?
He said, man, equipment is expensive.
Yes. Yes.
And he's a custom operator too. And he's just
Mhm.
like, I don't know how people afford to buy this stuff. Like I'm running over thousands of acres with my equipment and it's hardly penciling at that. So
Well, that's the one piece that has changed some is that one of the key pieces of equipment to buy is the biggest merger you can afford and pull because these guys will drop, they can run it all to one side and you end up putting 60 feet into a windrow. So it's already at the right stage for fermentation. So as soon as it gets in the windrow, you come through with your big chopper, you have much, much less hours on the chopper. much, much less cost on the chopper. It's a lot more expensive to run a chopper than a merger. So we go and merge it, lay it out wide. It gets down to 35% dry matter in about 2 or 3 hours. Merge it and chop it right away.
The other thing I was thinking about here too is I want to get into the piece about like the photosynthetic drying, and I think we should do that now. But the first question I have to ask with it is, does soil moisture have an impact on it? Like, because not every growing year is the same. And if you think about first cut, I think it's the very biggest variable for soil moisture. Like there's years where, we don't really get much rain in May, or there's years where we have a bunch of rain in May and we're going and cutting the crop, and you can see like just the amount of moisture that's in that soil. Does it have an effect on dry down?
Well, two parts on that. One was a farmer friend of mine was mowing some older brome grass, and I came over to see him, and he stepped off the tractor, and there was a splash. He was up to his ankles in water, and the mower was leaving all the dry hay right on top of the water. You can't get it dry that way. But I actually have looked at that. I had wet soil conditions. We mowed it we mowed it wide, and we mowed it in windrows. The interesting piece was after 3 or 4 hours of drying, under the windrows, it was still wet. The ground was still really wet. Under the wide swath, where it was laid out loose, fluffy, and full width, so it's not as thick and heavy, the ground was nearly dry under the wide swath compared to narrowing it up and putting it into a windrow right away and letting it dry in between. I know that's heresy, but that's what I saw, and I got pictures of it showing it was clearly made a difference.
Would you look at your cut height at that point, or are you just going to say, no, I'm going to cut it 4 inches high no matter what?
Well, if you're growing grass at B4, we go down to 3.5 on alfalfa. The main thing is that it spreads out the back of the machine uniformly and wide. And if it comes out, most of the machines are made, they put it at about 66% of cutter bar width. And those sides are drawn in, so you have two windrows and a wide swath in the middle. The wide swath will dry, the windrows will not dry. And then they say, see, it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work because the machine isn't set up right. It's like having a pickup truck with a V8 engine running on 6 cylinders. It isn't going to do the job. But if you get it to where it lays it out all the way, or you have a mower that does that, it's going to uniformly dry down. And as it comes out, it's laid loosely down on the ground. And so it's a lot more porous. The other thing, if you have a mower with a conditioner, all right, that's what you have. Take the wrenches and tear off all the shields on the back. The big shields, the small shields, and we were doing, New Holland brought us a machine to actually do our original work. And it had two little 9/16 inch bolted on deflectors right by the back of the rollers. We took those off and saw a significant increase in the drying rate because we did not bring the feed together. So the less you bring the feed together, the better you're at. And then there's another farmer up in Ontario. Roger sent me a picture of his, and he put a little two V bars on either corner of his mower. And as it still brought it in some, he had taken those little shields off, but the rollers were shorter than the mower. So when it brought it in, the V bars spread it back out again and put it out to full width so that it would dry properly. And with all the shields off, the forage comes out and floats down on the ground. If you put a deflector shield down, it hits that, makes a lump, and drops it on the ground, and lumps don't dry. But if you take all those shields off and let it fly out, it'll float down on the ground. And I saw this on triticale where we had the deflector shield down. It was in lumps, and they were only 6 to 8 inches tall. Where we took the shields all off and let it come out and float down, it was 18 inches deep because it was all fluffy, loose, and the sun was getting in there and drying it a whole lot faster. These are little pieces that make it work. The bottom line, where we did wide swath alfalfa versus conventional alfalfa, we had 25% higher energy in the alfalfa. The NELs, the net energy of lactation, was almost the same as corn silage.
Wow, that's pretty because yeah, corn silage you're looking at 1.7 typically. Haylage this year I've seen it's hard to get them. I haven't seen too many samples above 1.4.
But if you lay it out real wide and let the photosynthesis dry it, because as that is laid out full width in the sun, all of those leaves are photosynthesizing, which means they're converting carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and sugar. As they do that, they pull the water out of the petiole, which pulls the water out of the stem. And because the end of the stem is cut, the crop dries from the inside out, from the bottom of the stem up, and it actually ends up drying faster. Most farmers, when they first get the right mower to lay it out full width, the mistake that they make and the nutritionist has to deal with is they have a bunk or a silo full of stuff too dry. It didn't look that dry. Yeah, it didn't look that dry, but it was.
I think maybe we should kind of reverse a little bit. And I think a lot of people have heard about photosynthetic drying, but can you maybe just walk through the steps on why it works?
Why it works? Well, there's a couple parts. First of all, the plant is always photosynthesizing. And my daughter, I got a picture that she made for me. She took white flowers and put them in a vase. And some vases had red dye, some vases had blue dye, some vases had yellow dye. Came back 2 hours later, took a picture, and she had blue, red, and yellow flowers because the water was drawn up the stem to replace the moisture lost in the flower. The same thing happens in alfalfa, clover, and others. If you cut it off and the leaves are in the sun, it will photosynthesize and use up that water. That automatically pulls water out of the nearby cells, which is the xylem, which is where the water flows up to the leaves to supply it when it's standing there uncut. But you've cut it off. So it pulls that moisture out. Now, if you condition the stem with a roller conditioner, take a copper pipe and bend it until it kinks. How much water can you get through it? Not much. If you condition an alfalfa stem, you kink the copper pipe and you can't get moisture through. If you want to make it worse than that, use these darn flail conditioners. They are not a crop for legumes. Hold the legume leaf up, legume plant up, and I took my pen and I just ran it up from the bottom up on the leaf or the top down, it doesn't matter, with just my pen and my arm, which doesn't move very fast. And I stripped all the leaves off of it. We were doing a field day up in Guelph, and there was an extension agent there helping me. They had a brand new time conditioning mower, and they came through and mowed. And he and I went and we picked up the swath, and underneath were literally handfuls of leaves. I don't mean single leaves. I mean clumps of leaves still stuck together, all on the ground. The rake would not pick them up. It left them in the field. And 70% of your digestible components are in the leaves. And what are we doing with those machines? We're stripping the leaves off and throwing them on the ground. And it works the same in grasses like triticale. I had a farmer had one of those, and he was appalled when I picked up the swath and looked at all the leaves off of the triticale laying on the ground. They are one of the worst machines to use to make quality feed for dairy cows. Now, I just ticked off 3/4 of your audience, and machinery guys will probably have a contract out on me, but that's the fact of the matter. Those are horrible machines to make quality forage. We got guys that are just using mowers to do it. Matter of fact, I got a nice picture from one of the guys here. He bought a Vermeer mower, and I don't sell equipment. I don't get any cutbacks at all. But he bought a Vermeer, and Kuhn jumped on it first, Vermeer second. His mower mowed 18 feet wide and laid it out at, it was like 97, 96% of cutter bar width. It was laid out all wide. What the farmers have complained about is, as one farmer said, it took him 3 years to get through his thick head. When the mower goes out of the yard, he looks at his watch. 2 hours later, he sends the merger out, and behind the merger goes the truck and the chopper because it is ready in 2 hours. Most
Does
farmers don't believe that can happen, but that's what photosynthetic drying does.
does it matter on how sunny it is that day?
How sunny it is.
Like if you're looking at like an overcast day or something like that, like are you going to get it the same effect, or you're still getting enough radiation that it's working?
All right. At that point, you got to talk to the guy upstairs, not me. If you want it wetter
No,
than hell, drier than hell, or then I can help you. But you need to talk to the guy upstairs. But
yeah,
anyway, yes, there is to a degree. Some of my first work I did, it was a hazy, humid day. We mowed, and I used a stopwatch for each replication, so we made sure each was done the same length of time. In 2 hours, it was 40% dry matter in 2 hours. That's with a sidebar sickle mower and no conditioning. So it can do that. The other side of the coin is I had a farmer in Western New York when I first did this work, and he took one of his mowers out in December, and he took the back, all the rollers off and everything else off the back of it, and ran through an old brome gas field and looked at it. He says, "This looks pretty good." He says, so he went and did his other three machines. The next spring, he mowed his alfalfa. And then he called me up the next day. And thank goodness I was 5 hours away. It was too far for him to go and kill me because it did not dry at all. It was a damp, overcast day, about 40 degrees. I mowed the same time because I was making hay for my in-laws' horses. Another impossible job. But anyway, I was making hay for my in-laws' horses with a conditioning mower because that's all we had and that's all we were doing at the time. And mine did not dry either. And I told him, I said, there's a front coming through. He was out by Buffalo. I said, there's a front coming through. The sun is supposed to come out this afternoon. He says it's coming out now. So I said, give it a couple hours and then see what it does. He called me back 2 hours later. It's too dry. That is
that's a
normally
very quick turn of events.
Yes, yes. All of a sudden, he believed that, no, I'm not full of something. I am crazy, but I'm full of something. It works. If it's laid out right, wide, without the conditioning, etc., it can dry. But if it's a cold, damp, overcast day, it makes it tough. Now, in Canada, you get nights in the spring when you're doing your triticale where it goes down below freezing, down below zero, or close to it. Somewhere's in, for us, the 30-degree range. I don't know what that is, like 5 to 8 degrees, something in there, whatever 30 degrees range is. But anyway, if you don't have it dry as much as you want, and it's that cold at night, it stops respiration. You continue drying the next morning. If it's still warm at night, like 50, 60 degrees Fahrenheit, then you need to get it in the day it was mowed. And we put an inoculant on it, and our research found it didn't matter what the moisture was. It mattered if you put inoculant on and then cut it that 3/4 of an inch to an inch long we talked about earlier.
And any specific inoculant, maybe not brand names, but like strains, I guess.
Homolactic. A homolactic is what you want to use.
So like just a
Homolactic,
like you get
not a
away with
buchneri, not a buchneri.
just a
A
lactic
homo,
acid,
just a
lactobacillus, I guess.
homolactic is what you want to use. Yes. It'll
Yeah.
drop the pH in our study of triticale, direct cut, and we inoculated it and fermented it right away. So it was part of the study. That's why we're doing it that way. We don't recommend it. And we had the pH dropped immediately down to 3.8, 3.6, which is below the 4 that Clostridia will grow at. So there was no Clostridia, no butyric in the feed, even though it was wet.
Yeah, and I like that's the key. Like I know I have seen a lot more butyric this year. I don't know if I mentioned that already or not, but like it just seems like some samples were, looking at a lot in the 4s and 5%. Yeah, some of it, it's funny because some of the stuff, if you look at the actual feed, it looks okay. If you, some of it doesn't look okay. It's that like lime green color,
Mhm.
which, yeah, is never good in my opinion. So,
Well, one of the things that we found with the wide swath is if you look at a windrow or a swath, you take a cut crosswise on it, the outside is dry as baled hay. That's the white mold you see in the silos. The center of it is not dry at all. It's as wet as when you mowed it, but it's been composting for how long you left it out there, 2 or 3 days. That center is windrow composting. It burns off all the sugars in it and it starts tearing apart the protein. And that, when you break it apart, you could smell the butyric in it. That's where all the Clostridia and garbage is growing. So you'll have these packed little flat plates that stink, and then you have white powder for the stuff that's too dry. And the farmers that switched to wide swath same day haylage said that all disappeared. It looks like the corn silage silo now.
And like with alfalfa, is it like realistic to get down close to 4 on pH? Or are we looking at the mid to high fours for that?
If it has sugar in it to ferment,
That's
it
the
can
key.
drop the pH. The key
Yeah.
is a substrate for the inoculum. And that's where the inoculum looks. I didn't want to take up the time, but I could dig in I got piles of data, so I can dig into my early wide swath studies to see what I had for pHs on there and sugar levels. I don't remember. I don't think, I won't try to pick it up now. I got tons of stuff there. I'd have to wade through to find it.
Yeah.
But somewhere's in there is the data.
Yeah. And I
And
guess
I
that
know
they,
it's there because we cut. The other question you get is if I cut at 6 o'clock at night, I'll have higher
you
sugars.
walked right into my next question.
Yep. And I did a study on that. We took a wide swath mower. It was third cutting. It was in August. It went down below 50 at night. We went in, we mowed it at 6 o'clock at night. We mowed it at 6 o'clock in the morning. Yes, our extension agent actually got out of bed that early, but we mowed it at 6 o'clock in the morning and we mowed it at 9 o'clock in the morning. All of them at 9 o'clock had the same sugar level. It was in the toilet. All of them regrew because they were laid out wide, the leaves were up, and it was in the sun. They all rebuilt their sugar levels. So by the time we got to harvest, to chop, the sugar levels were back up, but the 9 o'clock did it from 9 o'clock to 1 o'clock, whereas the stuff mowed the night before had been sitting there since 6 o'clock in the morning. So we actually had a little higher numbers, but I don't know if it was statistically significant on the 9 o'clock cutting as opposed to the night before. Now, the other question, do I have to wait for the dew to come off? We had a heavy dew. I calculated 2 tons of water per acre on that crop, just from the dew, the weight of the dew. But when we mowed it early in the morning with the sidebar sickle, as it fell down, the water all ran off. Because we never conditioned the stems, the water ran off. If you condition the stems, it makes it into mush and it keeps all the water right with it. So you can go out early in the morning and mow and drop it on the ground with no conditioning. And nearly all of that water is going to shake and rattle off. And what is little is left is out in the sun and evaporates as soon as the sun starts to hit it and cranks out photosynthesis.
As long as you're cutting in the morning, it doesn't really matter. And I suppose like if you're looking at doing the photosynthetic drying, you're going to want to maximize the amount of sunlight that you have
Yes.
throughout the day.
Yep.
Like on the triticale side of things, because that's the next crop, or that's going to be the first forage crop here this year. Can you do it in a day without a tedder? Because last year the stuff was super wet. We didn't have ideal drying conditions. Like it was relatively, like when a lot of people were cutting, it was relatively cool out. So we're talking in the 50s, not much cooler than that at night either. Like it was pretty constant temperatures, but it just seemed like things just dried at a snail's pace. And the other thing too is we had super heavy windrows,
And
and
it sat there and it sat there and
yeah,
it sat there. Yes. All right.
yeah,
A couple issues on this. First, that problem is something I created for you. I actually admit that I screw up. I created that problem because when we had 1.25 tons, 1.5 tons, or 2 tons of dry matter, it dried real easy. That's
yeah.
what you normally have in a first cutting alfalfa. But we are getting all 4 or 5 cuttings of alfalfa in one harvest. 4 tons of dry matter, 3.5 tons of dry matter, and down here, 6 tons of dry matter? And my answer is, holy crap, how are we going to get this dry? And I'm trying to figure out ways to do it. Without a tedder, not going to happen. Not going to happen.
Wow, and that's like I've seen lots of it done. I had one producer, and we had talked about it the year before, and they were kind of reluctant to buy a tedder, but it was 40 grand, and they made phenomenal feed in the first year. Like it doesn't take a long time to spend or lose $40,000 on a forage crop.
Yes, yes.
It happens really quick.
What I do is there's two pieces that need the tedder. One is the guys who don't have the right mower. It lays it at 66% of cutter bar width. You better have the tedder follow you around. The others who are doing it right are mowing, and then 2 hours later walk out and pick up the top. It's all silver colored. Pick up the top and it's green underneath. Start tedding and bring those lower layers up and spread them out. Two pieces on this. One is you got to control the loose nut at the steering wheel. If they go hauling butt through the field, tedding something that's 3.5, 4 tons of dry matter, like they were doing third cutting alfalfa, they're going to make huge tedder lumps. It's like taco shells. It builds up into a V around the tine, heaves this big lump out the back, and that does not dry. You pull into your field, go a little ways, and get off and see if you're screwing it up or you're helping it. If you're screwing it up, you need to up your RPM and downshift several gears so the machine has time to pull it apart. Secondly, don't run it in the dirt. This is why we need the cutter bar up, so that we're at 3 or 4 inches so the tedder can pick it off and throw it. Two machines. One, and I don't sell machinery, Pottinger has a long tine and a short tine. So with a lower tine does not dig in the dirt, which helps. Vermeer makes one with a hook tine, and every farmer who has it says it does a great job of taking the top, throwing it, and then bringing the bottom and throwing that afterwards. So all the bottom ends up on top. So, and if you don't have either of those, just a regular tedder, that will still work, but you need to control the guy at the steering wheel so that they're not running it in the dirt or they're not running it too fast. And you do all of that and you have a 4-ton dry matter. You may be still, if you really want 35% dry matter, you may be at it the next day, simply because trying to get that much dry, if you don't have good drying, that is a challenge. I am working on trying to figure out how we can get around that, but I don't have the magic answer yet. Our success has been too good.
That was the thing that happened with this producer last year, and it was 35 dry matter when they chopped in. It's still 35 dry matter sitting in the silo. And what happened is they went in and mowed it, and then it might have been an hour or 2 hours behind the machine. They went in and tedded it, but you could still see because it had such heavy windrows. It was like a U or like a wave across the field. So they actually the next morning went back in and tedded it again. And funny enough, like they could only get maybe 3.5, 4 miles an hour right behind the cutter. They could double their speed the next morning, and it was just it was gorgeous. It was just feed guy gorgeous, I guess. But it was just like a flat. It was a carpet.
That's what you want. You want a carpet. Yeah, that's that second trip basically saved the crop. Yes, yeah. There's a real art in tedding, and not everybody has it.
No, I think it takes a lot of patience.
Yeah.
Well, and to be honest, they couldn't push the machine any harder than that, the 3.5 miles an hour, because they were just the slip clutches were going, and they just like it was such a heavy crop.
Yes,
that they just needed to be patient.
Apart.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the last thing you want to do on a brand new piece of equipment. So,
yeah.
Is there any other tips or tricks or things that producers should know about here coming into first cut in spring or winter cereals?
Get out and look at your fields. That is key, because this stuff can grow real fast and sneak up on you overnight. You need to be tracking. Take your south well-drained field and track what it's doing. The other piece is, if you have a lot of acreage of this, you may want to consider planting the north-facing or less well-drained fields to a later variety, because some guys, they end up in May and, oh my God, I got 450, 500 acres to get in one day. It's not going to happen. So that's where growing, or just like you do with the corn, but except for this is quality issue. So you plant some early season and you plant some later season. There is a new earlier season one out. I think it's called Gainer, and I think they're shipping it. I know they're shipping it to Canada. That
I've heard that name.
Yes, that matures about a day after rye. But the difference between triticale and rye is if you put the nitrogen on rye, it all falls down. You put it on triticale, it's still standing and increases the protein. That's why we like that. And then they have some later varieties that will you can put out there so that all of it isn't ready the same day. And that spreads your workload out a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that's something as we get into more acreage, like we can't harvest it all in a day, but a lot of times we can plant it all in a day. You know, like the equipment, the planting to the cutting to the harvesting equipment doesn't always line up. Usually like on the harvesting side, everything's pretty much geared to fit the system so everything works well. But then all of a sudden you're going through with a 40-foot air seeder or whatever like that, and you're bang out 50 acres in 3 hours, and then you're done, right? So
yeah. One of the machines I do like planting with is an air drill. I see them more up in Canada than down here. They really need to get them down here, but they do an awesome job because they plant each seed indexed. I did a study of drilled with my old drill, and somebody used a Hagee plot planter, which is the same as the air drills, while dropping each individual seed. The difference in yield, 22% for the index seed versus the old drill seed.
is that just because it spread it out nicer and you got better tillering?
Each plant is its own growing room and own tillering room.
Yeah.
And there was data out of Michigan that said something similar.
Well, Tom, I truly appreciate you coming on the podcast again. I know it'd been we were just a fledgling startup when you came on the first time, so now we're just a fledgling middle-aged podcast now.
Yeah.
But
then we'll have the old timer podcast.
At one of these points we will. Yep. No, but I really appreciate it. And I know like it's one of the questions and topics I get a lot from producers is on the work that you do with the hay in the day. And outside of that, inoculant and maybe a couple other things are probably the things I talk about most, especially coming into this time of year, is like how do we and I want it to be actively one of my focuses, like how do we maximize the amount of energy density in these forage crops? Because at the end of the day, like if we could push 70-75% forage, like it's good for the cow, it's good for the banker, it's good for the accountant, it's good for the fee guy. Like it just makes everything work well. And I think spending some time with you here and getting it right from the source, it has been really beneficial for the listeners.
Oh, good. Well, my job, I consider my job to be is to make all the screw ups so the farmers don't have to. And as one of my farmers' friends came back with, he says, yeah, we knew you were a professional screw up. But his next sentence was, thank you. You're helping us tremendously, telling us what not to do.
Isn't that science? Just one screw up at a time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, thanks, Tom. I appreciate it, and have a great growing season here.
Okay, you too. Take care.
Thanks for listening. This episode of the Dairy Farmers Digest is brought to you by the dairy team at Waldstein Feed and Supply Limited. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe and follow us on your favorite podcast player, and please leave us a review. If you would like further information about today's topic, check out the show notes for further details and our contact information. I would also like to extend a special thanks to Christine Swinderwood, our producer, and our sound engineer, Daniel Noguera.